It's a great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Randy Thornhill. Dr. Thornhill is a distinguished emeritus professor of biology at the University of New Mexico, and he is a prolific researcher who has expertise in both the evolutionary ecology of insects and of the evolution of human social behavior. And he is one of the founders of the line of thought Parasite-Stress Theory, which I'm excited to talk about today. Dr. Thornhill, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here with you, Adam.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
Sure. So I'm going to launch into some of my research interests, and then we'll go to the parasite-stress theory, okay?
Sure, we could do that. I also noticed that it looks like your background started off working with insects and animals, and then later on you moved towards studying human behavior. So that would also be great to talk about in your intro.
Right. As an evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in evolutionary processes, of course, and much of my early research and continuing now to a degree is on sexual selection processes. So these are processes associated with competition for mates and mate choice and so forth. And initially, I worked on insects, sexual selection processes in insects. I was the first person to ever do a field study of female choice of an animal. And it was female choice in an insect that I studied. And I'm still doing some insect work. I just published this year a paper with some Chinese colleagues on traumatic mating in an insect group. And so that insect research is still going on, sexual selection processes. And then I did some work on sexual selection in birds too. Did a big study of red jungle fowl, mate choice and mate competition and so forth. And we were the first to test the parasite-stress theory of sexual selection in an animal. And that was jungle fowl research. So basically the way that theory works, and it applies to humans too, we can get into that later, is that mate choosers are looking at traits associated with health and assessing individuals on the basis of health. So mate choosers are good veterinarians, basically, and looking for health markers and so forth. And human attractiveness and attraction, of course, boils down to health markers too that we're looking at. And we could get into that some if you wish. And then over the last 15 years, I've been working on values, core values of people, and I'm still very excited about that. I'm doing a little bit still with that, but to my delight, research on human values from the parasite stress point of view is being conducted now all over the place. Lots and lots of researchers have jumped in, doing some very exciting spin-offs from the theory and new applications going on in economics and political science and all kinds of neat research going on now on the parasite-stress theory.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I explain that theory?
Yeah, we should definitely talk about it. A couple months ago, I interviewed psychologist Mark Schaller, and we talked about the behavioral immune system. So I'm guessing there's some significant overlap with those two. So maybe we could explain parasite stress theory in relation to the behavioral immune system.
Sure. And I did some publishing with Mark initially. And yeah, the behavioral immune system, so humans have two immune systems. You can start there. There's a classical immune system, which is the T cells and the antibodies and thymus and spleen and all that stuff that you learn about in the standard immunology course at university. That's the classical immune system. And it was the first immune system discovered and most studied by biologists. But the behavioral immune system is also important, and research on it is now just exploding. And the behavioral immune system is the psychological and behavioral features associated with detecting, avoiding, and managing infectious diseases. And that's where values fit in. Values, core values of people are part of the behavioral immune system. So you want me to explain the theory?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great overview. And then parasite-stress theory.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So over the last 15 years, I've helped develop and test the parasite-stress theory of values and sociality. And the theory is a scientific theory about the proximate or ecological causes of human values. So those causes that work during the lifetime of the individual to give rise to the individual's values. And it's a theory about the ultimate causes too, the evolutionary causes of human core values. And by human core values, I mean the real wants and needs that we have. And that is really captured in cross-cultural psychology by the dimension of values, collectivism, individualism, a dimension of values. And captured in political science by basically the same dimension of values. They just call it a different thing: conservatism, liberalism. So collectivism is conservatism, individualism is liberalism. And you can, the scholars have figured out how to test a person's core values and place individuals on this continuum of values. You can do it for states. Now researchers are down to the county level in the United States, which is really cool, measuring average values per county. But you can do countries, states, and so forth, regions like that get average values. And so the theory is about the proximate causes during an individual's lifetime of his or her values, as well as the theory is about the ultimate cause of our values. And by that, I mean the evolutionary selection pressures that made the psychological adaptations that are important in acquiring values during our enculturation. So as we're growing up and going through life, we acquire values. We put values into our cultural repertoire of cultural thinking and behavior. And parasite level is important in the nature of the values we acquire. Basically, the theory says, and the empiricism now shows, that if you're growing up under high parasite level, you pull in conservative values. More parasites, more conservatism. Low parasite level, liberal values. And the lower the parasite, the more liberal the folks are. So that's kind of the general theory, and we've tested it. We started out testing it and doing some work initially with Mark Schaller too, and his colleague Damian Murray. So we started testing it with looking across countries. So there are good data on infectious disease levels that are in the literature, World Health Organization, and similar outfits tally infectious disease levels. So we pulled those data, and then we pulled data from the literature, published literature on values that cross-cultural psychologists and political scientists have published in the literature for countries of the world. Initially, we did the work at that level of region, and showed a predicted pattern from the theory. That is, as infectious diseases increase in countries, you get more conservatism. And that turned out to be a very, very strong relationship. Then we went to the state, US state level, and infectious disease levels are tallied by CDC for the states in the United States, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So we pull those data and look at the parasite level, infectious disease level across states in relation to values in the literature, published in the literature. It works the same way. More infectious disease, more conservatism. Lower infectious disease, the lower the infectious disease, and more liberalism across states and countries. So we did that, and then after we published our initial stuff, some experimental psychologists got into the research and did some cool stuff at the individual level. So what I described was comparative across countries and across states. But the experimental psychologists that initially got in started looking at what individuals do when they encounter infectious disease cues in the laboratory. So there was initially a slideshow of 10 slides that are shown to people. So you measure their values before they come into the lab, and you show them the disease cues in the slides, and then you measure their values after that. And the people became more conservative. And I should at this point break down conservatism from the literature, what political scientists and cross-cultural psychologists, how they define it as components. There's a tremendous amount of research on values because they're so important. They affect everything we do. So there's a huge literature. And the components of conservatism/collectivism are basically first, xenophobia. That's a big one. And that's dislike, avoidance of people, foreigners, people not in your group, outsiders, xenophobia. And so the more conservative you are, the more xenophobic you are. The less conservative you are, that is, the more liberal you are, the more xenophilic you are. You like foreigners and people different from you. You're fine with people with different values, different backgrounds, different colors, and so forth, as you move more and more toward the liberal end of values. So xenophobia is one component of conservatism. Another important component of conservatism is ethnocentrism, as scholars call it. And that's a focus and preference for local people like you in values, people that look like you, behave like you, have same background and so forth. And the more conservative people are, the more ethnocentric they are. So that's preference for local people. And it goes right along with xenophobia. Xenophobia is fear and dislike of people different from you, and ethnocentrism is like of people like you in terms of values and so forth. And then the philopatry is another component of conservatism, what biologists call philopatry. And that just means parochialism. That is, you're local. Okay, you like the local stuff. You don't travel, you don't move to new places, and so forth. That's philopatry and parochialism. And then traditionalism, of course, is an important component of conservatism. Liking tradition, disliking new stuff. So neophobia, it's called in the literature, new phobia, fear of new, and liking tradition. Do it the way granddaddy did and so forth, and no questions asked, black and white. And then let's see, authoritarianism. That's an important component of conservatism too. Mm-hmm. And that's basically fundamentally where your knowledge comes from, where your information comes from. It comes from traditional authority. So the church, your parents, you're very obedient as a conservative. You're getting your knowledge from traditional kinds of sources, not new knowledge. It's because there's neophobia, not new knowledge from the outside, but authoritarian and authoritarian leaders. So conservatives really, really revere their conservative leaders, as you see, in really, really extreme cases of authoritarianism, extreme conservatism, as was the case in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and fascist Japan, and like we had in the United States with Trump, all his authoritarian followers too. It's the same phenomenon.
So the variability in these conservative beliefs, most people would probably point to culture, whether that's where you were raised or how you were raised, but I'm guessing there are also environmental components like parasites or other environmental components, and then biological components as well. So is there research showing exactly what influences beliefs in what ways?
Yeah. So basically all those things are part of the same thing. That is, so we have, the way we think it works is this. So we have in our heads as human beings, these psychological adaptations associated with the acquisition of our cultural repertoires. So these are functional pieces of brain that are for specifically acquiring our culture. And a familiar one for accessing culture is the language psychological adaptation. So we got these specializations. As kids, we sift all the noise and so forth, and then all of a sudden we're speaking the local language, even the local dialect, very specialized acquisition psychological adaptations for acquiring language. The kinds of psychological adaptations I'm talking about that are functionally designed for acquiring values are like that, but they're designed to acquire values instead of language. And the acquisition works this way for the values. So as a kid, you're growing up. And let's say you're growing up in a high disease area. The highest disease area would be the equator. You're growing up on the equator. Parasites reign, everywhere, lots of infectious disease. So you're getting a lot of infectious diseases. Your immune system is being activated. Classical immune system is being activated frequently and chronically. That's information that is read by the psychological adaptation to guide you toward the appropriate values, which are conservative values under high infectious disease. So I haven't told you yet how those components of conservatism relate to defense against infectious disease. We'll get there in a minute, okay? So if you grow up under low infectious disease, then you acquire the optimal values for that, and that is liberal values. Liberalism's great. You have a big social pool, you like everybody, people are fine, they're different colors, they have different values and all that, that's cool. You got a big social pool, you got a bigger mating pool, and big social, a lot more social resources than a conservative would have. But under high infectious disease, you're going to be exposed to a lot of diseases as a liberal. So conservatism is the way to go. So let me explain now. So that's during an individual's lifetime, you're acquiring these values by psychological adaptations that were put in there by evolutionary selection in evolutionary history. That's what.
So this is kind of like an epigenetic effect where we were evolved with the capacity for both, but the environment is what brings out one direction or the other.
Absolutely, of course, yeah. And just like we're open to whatever kind of language too. You put a kid in speaking, a Spanish culture, that kid will get Spanish. You put him in English culture, he'll get English, or whatever the language is. The adaptation works to acquire those things that are functional against local problems. So you choose not only the local language, you choose the local dialect as you grow up and so forth. Under low infectious disease, liberal values work best. Under high infectious disease, conservative values work best. And let me explain the disease ecology part of this that is fundamental to the parasite-stress theory of values that I think will make a bunch of stuff clearer. So the host and their infectious diseases co-evolve antagonistically. It's an arms race. Got the host evolving to defend against infectious disease. You got the infectious diseases evolving to eat the host, to circumvent the defenses that the host has. And it's a constant co-evolutionary race. It never ends for any organism, plant, human, other animal, whatever. It's a constant thing. The property of these co-evolutionary races that is so important from the standpoint of the parasite-stress theory is that the co-evolutionary races are geographically localized. So you have a co-evolutionary race between hosts and parasites, and that results in the hosts being relatively immune to the local infectious diseases, but not infectious diseases that are geographically distant. So it's a localized co-evolutionary race that results in localized immunity, but not immunity to diseases from the outside. Hence, the xenophobia is very important under high infectious disease because you're avoiding people with different diseases by that. The neophobia, fear of new ideas and so forth, all that comes from the outside. You're avoiding that. The philopatry, you're not dispersing. You're staying in your area where you are, where you have your immunity to the local, relative immunity to the local diseases. And traditionalism, that allows you to avoid new ideas and so forth. So that the parasite stress theory values is very fundamentally related to our knowledge about host parasite coevolutionary races and the localization of infectious disease. And the localization can be very, very extreme. So, I mean, the disease literature is tremendous. Just pick a few examples. You have different strains of TB in different neighborhoods in Morocco, for example. You have different strains of schistosomiasis in villages that are only several miles apart and so forth. There's extreme localization. And we're seeing all the, the new variants popping up with COVID too. I mean, these variants, whatever infectious disease you got the variants popping up. That's a local thing. You get relative immunity over the generations to the local, but they're not adapted to the diseases from the outside. So hence the whole package of conservative values I described fits very well to deal with these localized infectious disease problems. And so you're relatively immune to the local, but not to the outside. You need a lot of social support and so forth when the diseases come, thus the ethnocentrism. Anthropologists have studied the importance of having a great social network locally when the diseases come. It gets you through, you and your family through when the diseases come. Having that local ethnocentric network, parochial network. So that's kind of a nutshell of it, and some of the empirical work. The recent empirical work going on is looking at people have been interested in the recent elections. So during COVID, we've had, before COVID and after COVID, we've had elections in the United States, 2016. You can look in the presidential election, you can look at infectious disease levels and how that maps on to conservative support for Trump. And that's all the way at the county level. Now they, and recent elections in France, recent elections in Poland, and more COVID in a region, the more votes for the conservative politicians in all those. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this is an interesting worldwide case study we can delve into, because I guess I have two devil's advocate claims, and I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about them. The first is that at least in the United States, it seems like we're moving in a more liberal direction, even during the pandemic, despite what parasite stress theory would predict. And the second one is you could make a claim about directionality. So for example, if the more conservative areas have more COVID, you could say that because of the extra parasite stress, they became more conservative. You could also say they were already more conservative and less restrictions led to more disease.
Yeah. But the second one is really not, I mean, that's part of it. So you'd have, so here's like a recent study has been done where you look at, you take, well, I think this study had a couple of 100,000 people in the U.S. And this is an internet study. You get their self-identified political partisanship, for example, or Democrat or Republican, and you get their self-identified level of political values on a scale of conservatism, liberalism, those kind of data. And early in the COVID, there was less conservatism, and later in the COVID, there was more. So I don't know where your empiricism is coming from when you say their liberalism has increased, because it very much depends on the region that you're talking about. Yeah, and I mean, the Trump folks are still the Trump states are still Trump states and so forth. They haven't liberalized down the southeastern United States.
So have the liberal states also become more conservative or less liberal during COVID?
It hasn't been done at the state level, but yeah, that would be the prediction, of course. It's been done at the county level. And yes, yeah.
Wow.
And more COVID, more conservatism. Yeah. So it would have to be at the state level too with that. Yeah. So let's see, what was your other caveat now? Or your concern?
That covered both of them. Actually, I guess the second one we only glossed over. So the second one is the directionality of it.
Oh, yeah, that's very important, actually. Thanks for bringing that up. So here's the way we think it works. So if you go back to the experimental psychology I touched on, where after we published the comparative work, the experimental psychologists got on it and started looking at individuals in the lab and showing them immediate disease threat kinds of slides. And it shifted the people to more conservative, okay? It made them more xenophobic. It made them more introverted. Introvert is a personality dimension that's part of the behavioral immune system. Extroversion being liberalism. That's been known a long time. So we tied it to the parasite-stress theory. So the people get more introverted, they get more xenophobic, and with seeing these slides. Now, but the researchers also measured the values of the people before they showed them the slide. And the more conservative the people were up front, the bigger the effect of the slides on shifting their values toward more conservatism. So if you've got a very conservative area already because of a history of high infectious disease, and you add a lot of COVID, it's going to have a bigger effect. That's the, that's the way that works. But also related to the direction of causality, you can look at it this way. So in high infectious disease areas, you get conservative people, and that manifests as conservative governance too. We've done a lot with governance across the world, autocracy, democracy of all the countries of the world, and related them to the parasite-stress theory. But so in a conservative place, you get conservative people, you get conservative governance, and conservative governance itself really fosters infectious disease as follows. So conservative folks are very, with conservatism, you have conservative values. So you've got classism, for example, and even to extremely conservative governance, you get, the people that are not in your proper group or out group, and even to the point of being dehumanized, under high conservatism. So you get all these poor people who have nothing, no opportunity and so forth because of the conservative governance, and making them subhuman in general, not caring about their rights and liberties. And that goes along with highly conservative governments, autocratic kinds of governments everywhere in the world, not just in the history of the United States, but everywhere in the world. And so that creates lots of disease problems. People don't have proper facilities, they don't have any health care, and so forth. And under that kind of, so conservatism really, in a way, can promote more infectious disease. It's good. It's really a value system that was ancestrally quite adaptive in human evolutionary history, and that's why it evolved. But now it can even promote more infectious disease at the government level. Yeah.
Yeah, that leads into my next question, because you would assume that people who are more conservative and thus more sensitive to pathogens would be the ones advocating mask mandates as opposed to the other way around. And I don't want to get too political, but just looking at this from the parasite-stress theory.
Right. No, we have to get sort of political here, but we're not. But I'm to say that the political aspect is I'm speaking from the empiricism aspect. Okay, so as as a scientific theory, the parasite-stress theory of values does not contain any moral guidance. It doesn't say conservatives are more moral than liberals or vice versa. There's no moral guidance there. It just deals with causation. That's what scientific analysis does. It deals with causes. So let's see. What was your point now?
You would think that more conservative people would be more likely to
following the mandates and masks and distancing and all that. No, that's where the authoritarianism comes in. So we had, for example, in the United States, the most is known about it. So we had a very, very conservative governance, the Trump crowd. And Trump himself, who, he's like a god to the authoritarian followers. You get in all these authoritarian regimes like Hitler and so forth. All these people would follow their leader anywhere and do whatever he says, follow him off a cliff, as the Nazis did. So you get these people that are highly authoritarian. Trump is saying that there's no COVID, it's a hoax, don't worry about it. Wearing a mask is PC, all that kind of stuff that was total nonsense. And the authoritarian followers bought it fully. And that's why that's where the unvaccinated crowd is and so forth. You don't need these vaccines. I mean, if you go high conservatism, those people don't even believe in science. They're very negative about science in general because their information comes not from science and knowledge, it comes from tradition and traditional leaders. They're leaders. So that's the way that works. Yeah, it is consistent, but it's a roundabout.
Right. So earlier on, you mentioned all of these various aspects of conservative values, and it seems like some of them they're not all equal. Some of them outrank others.
Outrank in what sense?
In the sense that these authoritarian tendencies that you mentioned might outrank the pathogen sensitivity.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. See, but an authoritarian who is following, say, the Trump ideology about infectious disease doesn't believe the infectious disease is real. So it's not as so if you take highly conservative people and you measure their discuss sensitivity, which is a validated questionnaire in psychology measure, they're highly discuss sensitive and worried about infectious disease. But then they don't think, because Trump has said COVID is no problem, they don't apply it to that. That's the way that works. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So it does seem intuitive that more disease would lead to more conservatism. I guess my next question is, why aren't all humans like that all the time? What is the push for liberalism when there's not as much disease?
Let's see. Let's look at a good test case that will really illustrate that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as I mentioned, we know that empirically, in countries with that have controlled infectious disease, you get more liberal people. We know that, and you can take. But here's a really good test case. So the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s in the West, specifically in the Western world, and by the Western world, I mean Canada, the United States, Western Europe. Australia, New Zealand, places like that, the Western world. There was this Cultural Revolution, and I was there. It was in the 60s and 70s. And what happened was, you got all these liberals, all of a sudden these young people, college age, young adults, who really were anti-authoritarian. They didn't want war, they didn't, Vietnam War, they wanted us to get out of wars in general. They were interested in civil rights, the rights of people that had been socially disfranchised since the whole history of this country became human beings all of a sudden. The feminist movement, females became legitimate human beings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So there was all this liberalism civil rights, feminism, all kinds of more subtle things. Child labor laws got more liberalized. There was a sexual revolution, all the sex practices and so forth became more liberalized, attitudes toward those. So let's look at the background of that. And so we go to the medical historians that have studied this stuff. And they have documented in great detail the history of health interventions in the West. Start with 1920s, chlorinated water in the West, not anywhere else, in the West. It spread very quickly throughout the West. Put a little chlorine in water, it kills almost every infectious disease. So starting in the 20s and thereafter, people were being raised in very, very different disease ecologies than ever before because of chlorinated water. So also in the 20s, some more subtle things happened. The first food processing laws came. So people had to, for public food, had to process foods in particular ways, sanitary ways, hygienic ways. Also, the sewage treatment plants started in the 20s, and more indoor plumbing and pipes going to sewage treatment plants before people were just public defecating. So that was a big health improvement to sewage treatment plants. Then we jump up to and that all improved in the 30s too, starting in the 20s. Then we jump up to the 40s. So in the 40s, decent antibiotics came along right after World War II, broad spectrum antibiotics. There was some sulfa drugs in the 30s, but they caused real bad side effects, about as bad as diseases. But the good antibiotics came right after World War II and spread immediately in the Western world. And spread so fast that very quickly there was resistance to antibiotics that came about, and regulation of antibiotic use and so forth. Now, all that history is known and published by medical historians. So also in the 40s, child vaccination programs began, specifically in the West, and to vaccinate the kids. And people didn't oppose the vaccines then. The leaders weren't saying, don't get your vaccine, it's a hoax and all that crap. And so it was a different world with regard to vaccination then. Also in the 40s, there were big attempts to drain swamps in the West, swampy areas. And where I grew up in Alabama, the whole Tennessee River was diverted and changed to get rid of, what was basically one big swamp, one big breeding ground for mosquitoes and malaria and so forth, yellow fever. So all of that changed. All the damming of rivers changing to reduce swamplands. That was a big effort. I mean, that was as important as antibiotics at that point.
So all of these advancements in sanitation and medicine were antecedent of the big liberal movement that came later.
A generation or two, depending upon the particular health intervention. A human generation is 20 years. Then all of a sudden you get all these liberal hippies and so forth, free love, make love, not war, anti-authoritarianism, just amazing cultural change. Also, I mentioned too, screens came along, screens on windows came along in the 20s too, and that had a big effect on reducing vector diseases. All this stuff. And lo and behold, you got all these liberals. Yeah.
And you think it was directly causally related?
Yeah, must have been. Yeah.
Wow.
That's totally consistent with everything else I've said about infectious disease and bays. Yeah.
So from an evolutionary perspective, why do we move towards liberalism when there's less disease, as opposed to staying on guard all the time, even if there's no disease, remaining highly conservative?
Because of the value of of out-group social interaction. So liberals can be viewed as really out-group specialists. We're very good at making friends with people that are different from us. And of course, social resources are fundamental to survival and reproductive success throughout human evolutionary history. They're not only important to us now in terms of, we want our friends and all that, but they were the bottom line in terms of survival and reproductive success in human evolutionary history. So with openness, openness is another component of liberalism as opposed to closed-mindedness, and it's a personality component. With openness toward other people, you're fine with interacting with people that are quite different from you, and you got a bigger social pool and more social resources. So that's the value of it. So we're designed to be very sensitive to what's going on with the local infectious disease levels, adjusting our values accordingly, and to meet the challenges appropriately that are local. Yeah.
So throughout our evolutionary history, there was this constant balancing the scales of benefits through open-mindedness, and then minimizing harm through conservatism.
You got it. Very, very complicated aspect of our social life. I've even suggested that complexity of social change, was very important as part of the selection that built our big brains in the first place. So we have big brains according to prevalent theory because of complex social life. Brains are, very well designed for complex social life. But this is really a cool, complex part of social life that has been ignored in discussions of how social life is related to the selection that built our big brains. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, could you expand on that, on how exactly this led to bigger brains? I know it means managing more complex social information, but what type of information is that exactly?
Well, you got the manipulation you got to avoid. You got the deception you got to avoid. You got the sincerity, the honesty you got to identify in people, and all that is incredibly complicated. And bigger brain. You look at across primate species comparatively, and the more complicated the primate social life is, the bigger the brain in relation to body size. And so that's part of the big brain theory of the evolution of human, sophisticated cognitive abilities, all of our really sophisticated cognitive abilities.
Mm-hmm. Is there any sort of handicap effect when it comes to human response to pathogens? Because you could imagine someone who's more liberal, even in a dangerous environment, they might be more likely to die, but the ones who survive would thus be showcasing their higher fitness in that way.
Their higher fitness in what way?
If someone doesn't adopt these conservative values in a high disease environment, then they might not survive, but the ones who do survive would thus have that fitness benefit.
Yeah, but they would be out reproduced by individuals that were more conservative, in general, would be the net selection process going on if disease levels were real high. Yeah, if disease were real high. Because with your conservative values, you're interested in people. You might, marry somebody in the 2 villages down or something like that, and that might kill you because they'd have different schistosomes.
Right. So we talked a lot about the epigenetic effects, but it still surprises me how there's so much variability just across local regions when we're talking, across state lines, for example, when these states have only existed for a couple hundred years, and we're talking evolutionary time spans.
Yeah, right. Well, that's on a proximal level, these people are adjusting values in relation to their encountered infectious disease. I mean, even at the even at the county level, you can, there's variation in average values, and that's related to CDC levels of infectious disease,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. But it's all this subconscious biological process, like people wouldn't know what they're responding to.
I mean, some of it's conscious. You get back in the 70s. So it was big, a lot of, all these liberal folks, and I was one of them, coming along, and going for finding yourself was a big effort, finding yourself. And what happened was you get all these people who had grown up in a conservative culture where there was no such thing as independent self. Conservatives are intellectually interdependent on the in-group. So they don't have intellectual autonomy and so forth. And all of a sudden you got these liberals who were thinking so differently than the older people around them. And were, consciously trying to find self. He's off trying to find himself, that sort of thing. It was such a big effort. So sometimes it's conscious, but most of it is the underlying stuff is certainly out, subconscious.
Uh-huh. Do we see these same patterns even earlier in history? Like, was the Enlightenment brought on by advancements in preventing disease?
Of course.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's the prediction, of course. Nobody has done anything sophisticated with the Enlightenment in terms of the parasite-stress theory, but they'll get there. Because I've suggested that basically what happened was the Enlightenment really was the first individualism, liberalism in the history of humanity.
Right.
And these people who really, really like knowledge and new ideas and all that kind of stuff, And the Enlightenment arose in high latitudes. That's one empirical piece that's important to realize. So infectious diseases, of course, follow very closely a latitudinal gradient. So the more lower the latitude, closer to the equator, the more infectious diseases. And as you move either south or north, infectious disease levels decrease. And so you got the Enlightenment in relatively disease-free places. There were lots of diseases then, but relatively low disease. So you couldn't get the Enlightenment at the equator, for example, according to the parasite-stress theory. Right? And you still don't have the Enlightenment at the equator. Note, yeah.
Yeah, you're having me very convinced, and hopefully most of our audience as well.
If you read my book, you would be a true believer. Yeah.
Yeah. So having established these very consistent findings, what is there in the sense of like how can we use this to our benefit, whether it's through intervention studies or anything like that?
It depends on our benefit. So I mean, conservatives and liberals view benefit, social benefit, very differently, of course.
Mm-hmm.
As a conservative, what could we do? Well, we've got to make the world more conservative. We've got people, we've got to get rid of people more religious and more belief in tradition and love of country and all that kind of stuff. That's what we've got to do. And to do that, you want to nurture the infectious diseases. Because more infectious diseases, you'll get more patriotism and nationalism and fascism and all that stuff that conservatives love. And if, on the other hand, you ask a liberal about a better world, a liberal wants democracy, freedom, opportunity, equal rights for everybody, that kind of stuff. And of course, that would involve control of infectious disease. And so it depends on what you define as better. But if, let's say you wanted to make the world much more democratic, work on that, if that were your goal. And again, the parasite stress theory of values is a scientific theory. it has no moral guidance in it at all. It's just about causation. So it doesn't say getting the world more liberal is better. It doesn't say getting the world more conservative is better. But if you wanted to make the world more democratic, get rid of all the prejudice and so forth in the world, then you would work hard on controlling infectious disease and good health care too. I mean, that's just part, the health care is just part of it. You want to start with the basics. I mean, the first thing you do is give people clean water. You know, there are lots of places in the world that still don't have clean water, and they're the most conservative Jewish places in the world too. So you first give them clean water. That's cheap. You know, civil engineers I've talked to say it's really cheap to put a little fluorine in the water. The problem is conservatives won't drink it sometimes because it tastes different. You know, they're traditionalists. It tastes really different, and so you got all those problems you'd have to deal with. But if you really wanted to liberalize the world, then you do another, you know, on a bigger scale than what happened in the 20s and 40s and so forth that I described. Work on that constantly, control infectious disease.
Right. So it's clear that the more liberal we become globally, the more susceptible we are to infectious disease. But if we ignored that, are there any other costs that would come along with it? That, because right now I'm kind of framing liberalism as it's all benefits except for the infectious disease part, which is why what we discussed earlier, why we're not automatically conservative regardless of disease status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, are there other costs of liberalism? That's your question, right? Besides infectious disease, I think that's fundamental to infectious disease. I mean, you get a whole different. I mean, it depends. You know, again, you take a conservative people who say, you know, Mussolini, for example, he's about as conservative as you get, and he hated liberals because they travel too much. You know, he said liberals go out and travel, they bring all these infectious diseases back, that kind of stuff, so they travel too much. That was a benefit. You know, that was a cost to him of liberals. So it just depends on. And then, you know, conservatives have a different family structure. So liberals start there, have more of a nuclear family structure. You have some extended family. You know, you probably know some of your cousins perhaps, but if you were highly conservative, you'd know your second cousins, the third cousins, and great aunts and all that stuff. It's a very different, and some people would see that as a benefit of conservatism, to have these strong family values that are more restricted in liberal kinds of families. So it depends on what level you're talking about benefits and costs, I think. Yeah.
That makes sense. It is very hard, at least for me, to not automatically assign a moral good or bad to these different categories.
Yeah, because you're a human being. You're human. Yeah, we got it. We have our value system, and we think in terms of values because it's so strategic for our social success, how we present ourselves and so forth. You know, in a university culture that you're in, I'm in. You know, if you start talking fascism, you would lose all social support immediately. Start talking highly conservative, you know, language. There goes your social support. But in a current conservative environment, everybody be patting you on the back. So we're very, very careful about our, you know, and judging all the time as we proceed. But the science itself is non-judgmental. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to close.
Okay.
Dr. Thornhill, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Great to talk to you.
You as well. This was very informative.
Thanks for being prepared. Yeah.
Thank you.